We're going to talk to the, we're going to talk to it. We're going to talk about the Idaho Public Records Law. This manual, similarly, is hot off the presses. We just revamped it, and it includes the statutory updates with the law was changed this year. Betsy did some work on that, as well as several other groups. It was actually one of the more interesting coalitions I think I've worked with on a public records issue. When you have the dairymen and the press together on the same side, you're in for a pretty neat experience. But this manual has that. We shuffled the format, we put the questions up front, and then we put the law in the back. We're open to feedback on how we can improve that as a piece. We want to make it as functional and useful as possible. Remember, we're dealing with the legislature, so if it swims, quacks, and waddles, it's a dog still, if they say it is. Definitions. We start out with custodian, and custodian is just simply the person having the custody and control of the record in question. One of the things that we have had to deal with is sometimes we'll have a governmental entity get into a battle over who the custodian of a record is. And really all they need to do is take a piece of paper that they were given and hand it 2 doors down. But instead they send a denial letter. And it's just, I firmly believe that government is a customer service business. And the faster you can satisfy your customers, the constituents, the more successful you're going to be in this endeavor. And so if you get in that situation and it really is something like you just walk it down the hall, it's probably in your best interest just to walk it down there and get the records out. We've had occasions where things come into our office and they really should be addressed to the client. And we don't send them a denial letter. We give it to our client and say, hey, we'll help you respond to this. It came to our office. It goes a long way down the road. Writing. It includes, but is not limited to, handwriting, typewriting, printing, photostatting. I don't even know what that is, but I think it was something.
Showing his age.
Photographing. I noticed that mimeographing isn't on there. And you know what? I think that mimeographing isn't on there because if it was, people would make that request just to smell the ink. It has nothing to do with public information. And then probably the most important phrase here is every means of recording. And so what that includes is texts, emails. How many folks in here have a Facebook profile or page that they use for government? Nobody? No way. City, oh, the city does. So if you've got a Facebook and you've got a wall and people are posting comments on that, those are all public records. And so you have to make sure that you have the ability to print that out and respond to a public records request. I know that, I know one city in particular down south has a Facebook page, and every now and then they get folks to just throw stuff up on there that doesn't probably belong on a Facebook page of a public profile. And so they delete it, but before they delete it, they print it out. And that way if somebody ever comes back and says, hey, I want to see all of the records associated with this, they've got it. The other thing with Facebook pages is they have to be 100% public. Meaning if I click on your Facebook page and the block comes up from Facebook that I have to log in to see it, that doesn't comply. It has to be 100% open because it's a public record. The other thing that I will tell you about texts, emails, and Facebook profiles is that you have to comply with the records retention statutes. And so if you've got government, like commissioners exchanging texts on obviously non-decision points, as we learned in our open meeting law, make sure you've got the ability to archive those and retain them under the proper classification for records. And so that's an added burden if you've got texts and everything else out there. State agency is everybody. There's not really any wiggle room there. There is a similar definition for local agency under the statute. And then just in case you think that you somehow did not get in there, they have also defined a public agency as any state or local agency. And so this gives you a good example of sometimes how we get really excited about definitions. And then public official is any state, county, local whether elected, appointed, or hired. So that includes everybody. If you work for the government, you're considered a public official under this, which becomes important because anything you do within the course of your business is probably a public record. Public record is any writing containing information relating to the conduct or administration of the public's business. And this is an important concept. And a good example of this is, how many folks here heard of the Kootenai County Coles versus Kootenai County case? It involved a series of emails between the prosecutor and a court worker. And one of the things that came out of that case was that you can have private emails within the workplace. So for example, if I send an email to my wife and I say, I'm on the way home, do you need me to pick up anything? And she shoots back, yeah, can you grab a loaf of bread and a jug of milk? That probably is okay. It has nothing to do with the public's business. There's probably no reason to disclose that. But if we have 400 of those emails in a day, now all of a sudden, those are public records. Because why? What has happened there?
You're not doing your job.
Not doing your job. Now all of a sudden that kind of oversight of, well, wait a minute, if you've got time to send 400 emails and this banter with your wife, what's really going on in the office? And the problem that we have is we don't know where that threshold is. And so I can't stand up here and tell you you're entitled to 5 private emails a day. And that's the real risk here. And so be very careful with email. In fact, if you want to tell your wife you're coming home, that might be a good phone call, just so you don't get into that battle. And then, let's keep going. Right to examine. Every person has a right to examine and take a copy of a public record of this state. And there's 2 things here. Number one, if somebody says, I want to look through the public records, they have that ability. That can cause its own set of problems depending on what they want to do and the fact that you have a duty to maintain the integrity of the public records. But they have the right to look through them. They also have the right to take a copy of them. And so you have kind of two rights under the law. And then if you're going to just examine them, you have to do it during working hours. You can't say, yeah, I want to come down and look at them at 3 a.m. on Friday night after I've spent 4 hours at John's Alley. From what I've heard. And then you can establish a copying fee schedule. And if you're going to charge a fee, you have to have a schedule. And so again, there's a notice component so that people know what you're charging for your copies. You can require that the public records request be in writing. Again, I would use some reason and discretion there. If somebody comes in and says, can I get a copy of the minutes from last week's meeting? Just hand it to them. I don't know that you need to go through the whole fill out the form thing. Now, if you think for some reason that they're going to get the record and then accuse you of not giving them the record, yeah, you probably need them to fill out the form. Now the law allows you to submit and respond to those requests in email. And so if you do require a form, make sure that they can submit that form or submit that request via email. There are now copy fee restrictions, and I will come clean and let you know that in some of the examples the state was a bad actor in this, as well as certain other entities. We had a public records request that came across my desk where the governmental agency that was responding to it wanted to charge $50,000 to respond to a public records request. And they had a lot of stuff in there. And it's actually an interesting experience with the Public Records Act, because when you looked at the request, there were some very voluminous things within the request, but then there were some really routine things, like I just want a copy of the minutes from the last 3 meetings. And the agency just sent out this blanket $50,000 to get all the records. There was no effort to say, look, here's the easy stuff, but this hard stuff we're going to have to charge you for, and here's what it's going to cost. I think it goes back to customer service. You can't exceed the actual cost to the agency. And so when you look at the cost of a copy, you can't include administrative costs in that. It's just what does it cost for your copy machine per page, toner, that's it. $1 is probably too high. 50 cents is probably too high. I think that when you look at a per copy cost, you probably want to see what Kinko's is charging. It's got to be kind of within that ballpark. A nickel, 10 cents a page. That's kind of your ballpark there. You can establish a fee to recover the actual labor costs associated with locating and copying documents in certain cases. And now the first 2 hours or 100 copies are free. That means that probably 90% of your public records requests should now be free. Meaning they come in, they get the records, they're done. There's nothing to charge or anything else. If you are in the charging range, it's at the slowest person on the staff capable of responding to the request. When you charge the fee, it has to be itemized, meaning you are being charged at this rate per copy. You ordered 500, you asked for copies of records that equal 500 copies. 500 times a nickel is whatever. You go down to the person who put it together. It took us 6 hours to go through and find and locate the records and redact them. 6 hours at this person's rate of pay, which was $12.50 an hour. That's the rate you pay. You add that up. It has to be in that detail so that folks know what they're paying for. And again, there were bad actors within the system that would just throw a lump sum out there with zero itemization. Again, customer service, if a legislator makes a public records request of you and you give them a lump sum, you're probably going to wind up with a legislative solution. True story there. So when you ask, how did this all come about, that's one of the examples that led to it. And then, but you can require advance payment. And so if you've got a request that's going to require a lot of work and a lot of payment, you can require an advance payment. Our office has had the experience where people have come in and requested a ton of records. We've gotten them all together, and then we've said, if you have your, $800, we'll give you the records. Oh, I don't want them anymore. And we put a ton of time into it. And so now you can require advance payment.
So that means theoretically, every office in the courthouse, the clerk's office, the assessor's office, could have a different rate?
They could. I would recommend that the rate should, yeah, based on the employee fulfilling the request, yes, the rate will be different. I think that for copies, though, you may want to have kind of it's probably worth your while to consider a county-wide rate. But yes, so depending on the employee who responds to it, the rate will be different. And then the other thing is, if you've got somebody that comes in every week and requests 99 copies, this also happens. You can aggregate. And so you can say, look, you've been in here 3 weeks in a row, we're going to now start charging you because you've exceeded your threshold. I think the non-legal term is worn out your welcome. When you respond to a request, you grant or deny it within 3 working days, or you ask for more time. If you need more time, you can only request more time to locate the record or to redact otherwise exempt information from the record. You can't, the 10 days isn't we can't decide if it's exempt or not exempt. And I will tell you that nothing will make a constituency read faster than submitting a public records request, getting a 10-day letter, and then having their request denied at the end of that 10 days in its entirety. And so if you're going to deny it, just deny it and take your lumps. Sort exempt and non-exempt material, that's important because when you have the exempt material, if you go to court over it, the judge reviews it all in camera, which means secretly in his chambers. He looks at it and then he's going to make a decision. Yes, you acted properly and this is the exemption that applies, or no, these are public documents, they should be disclosed. You can inquire now to narrow the request. And so if somebody comes in and says, I want the minutes from the last 5 years of city council meetings, you say, look, that's going to be about 1,000 pages. It's going to take us 20 hours to put it together. It's going to cost you $250. Is there something specific you're looking for? And the person may say, oh, you know what? I just want to know about the boat launch stuff. And so we say, oh, well, we handled that in August, so I'll get you those minutes, and if you need some more, give me a call back, and handle it that way. Importantly, under the public records law, you do not have to create a record that doesn't exist. And so if somebody comes into you and they say, I want an Excel spreadsheet of all of the city workers' salaries for the last 5 years, and you don't have an Excel spreadsheet, you've got it in Word, you just have to give them it in Word. You don't have to create a record that doesn't exist. Similarly, a lot of times folks get mad because they ask questions within the public records request. You don't have to respond to the questions. It's up to you. That's a political question, if you want to respond to the questions or not. The Public Records Act just means that if there's a document, some sort of writing out there, you have to produce it to the public. If they attach all sorts of questions like, I want to know what this means, you don't have to answer that. If you fail to respond within 10 working days, the default is that it's denied. I will tell you right now that if you're going to deny a request, deny it in writing, put down the specific exemption, state the statutory reason for the denial, state that they have a right to appeal. The sole remedy under the Public Records Act is an action in the district court. And then also, there's a provision in there that says that you had an attorney review the denial, or you had the opportunity to have an attorney review it, and you chose not to do so. I call that the idiot provision. Because if the code tells you to have an attorney review it, why would you say we're not going to do it? It's very important that you have these in writing and that your attorney reviews it if it's a denial. Does anybody know why that's important? What's the protection there? The Public Records Act has a bad faith penalty. And so your best protection against a bad faith penalty is that your attorney reviews it, that it's in writing, you comply with all of the statutory requirements, with the exemption number, the right to appeal, and then that attorney clause. Because what you want to do is you want to show the judge, we've tried as hard as we can to comply with this, but the material's exempt. And so if you skip any of those steps, what's the easy conclusion for the judge? And it turns out to be a public record. Well, they acted in bad faith, especially if you don't even respond. That's probably your worst case scenario. As an attorney, I think your attorney would be saying, guys, give me something to work with here. Exemptions. There are myriad exemptions. There's probably 10 to 15 pages of exemptions in the red manual. A few of them that we deal with quite a bit: law enforcement and investigatory records, that comes up all the time. Emergency response plans, personnel records. Important note about personnel records, and actually this audience probably knows more about this than most others based on recent events, but the personnel record is the only one that says shall not disclose. And that was actually the underlying reason for why the case was filed here to disclose those public records, is because it's the only provision within the Public Records Act that says shall not disclose. Because otherwise, it's very simple. If you have an exemption, it doesn't mean you have to not disclose it. The public interest may outweigh the exempt interest, resulting in a need to disclose an otherwise exempt record. Interestingly, the court, when it looked at this at the Bustamante Records case, employed that same balancing test. It said, in this case, based on these actions, the public interest far outweighs any privacy interest that we could consider, and they ordered the records released. And so that's the equation that you apply in those circumstances.
Now there is an exemption if I'm sending emails doing my public business on my personal smartphone or on my personal computer, then those records are exempt. Isn't that right?
Not necessarily. If you're doing public business on your personal phone, you may have converted those records to become public records, and it's because you're transacting the public's business. And the Public Records Act expressly states that you cannot contract with a third party to avoid application of the Public Records Law. That's 9-338, paragraph 13. And so if you have a personal laptop or a BlackBerry or something and you start doing business on that, those records are probably public. And again, you may have a bigger issue as far as records retention policies and whatnot. So be very careful in that area. Trade secrets. I will say one thing about trade secrets. A lot of times this issue comes up in the RFP or bidding process. If you have a bid or an RFP that's going out that you think may involve trade secrets, a good thing to put in there is to request that any responder put their trade secret information into a separate envelope marked trade secret. And that way you know immediately, I gotta stop and think about this one, talk to an attorney or whatever. And so it's a good technique to make sure that you know that information up front as a governmental entity. Yes, Representative Trim.
Right, I remember several years ago where we had legislation passed, specifically came out of the University of Idaho in terms of protection of research work.
Yep, and that's still, it's there. If you're working on university research, it's there, I think, until you publish it. And then upon publication, it becomes public. So it's not a forever. Yes?
The next one is library records. What library records may be protected and what be, in other words, be exempt and what are not? Obviously,
So if you look at
things like
9-340E within the red manual, it's
Okay.
in your manual. Those, again, these are very specific exemptions. One other note with regard to exemptions. The exemptions are narrowly construed and they're very specific. And so every record starts out as a public record. If you're in government and you create a document, it is a public record. The question is there an exception that applies to it?
Right.
And the exception may only apply to portions of the record. Therefore, you have to redact or remove certain portions of it. And so you may have a record that the only thing public on it is the title of the document and everything else is exempt. You have to give that document out.
Yeah.
You just redact everything. There are documents where everything is exempt. But if you have exempt and non-exempt material, that's why you have to redact.
Yeah.
The starting point is every record is public. Draft legislation is exempt, which that's a good example of the entirety of the document is exempt. Yeah, go ahead.
You've got bids up in 9340D. Bids are required to be opened publicly and read aloud. Where does it get into being exempt from an open
It's exempt until you open it, because otherwise what's the point in having...
unopened bids are exempt.
Right, and so it's exempt until you open it,
Makes all
otherwise there'd be
sense in
no
the world.
point in having
Okay.
the bidding process, because you'd just be the last person in every time. Access to exempt records. A person can inspect and copy records pertaining to themselves, and there's even a procedure where they can amend the record, and that, again, that's a very special category. It's only if it's about yourself. You don't get access to like a law enforcement record of an open investigation about you. That does not apply. We've had folks try that. If you want to enforce your rights under the public records law, your sole remedy is a civil action under the public records law. That's in the district court, and you can file that as a citizen. When that happens, you submit the records that are at issue. The court reviews them in chambers, and then the court will say these are exempt, these are not exempt. You actually just had that process unfold here within the last couple of months. And then there's, as I said before, there's a bad faith penalty. The bad faith penalty is attorney fees and up to $1,000 fine if you withhold records that should have been released. You're immune, so if you release a record that was exempt, if you are trying to comply with the law, you're okay. You're not going to get in trouble for that. Any questions? Yes?
If the only copy of something that we have to examine is, say, someone wants to look at the minutes from when the city started, so they're from the late 1800s, can we require that they look at them in a certain way and that,
Yeah.
so that, if we have to have them with gloves on or whatever, just,
Yep.
protect those records?
Yeah, I was actually doing some constitutional research, and so I was in the archives looking at the original Idaho Constitution, and I had these crazy white gloves on because you can't get oil on it, I guess.